Nations Royalty made history this year as the first majority Indigenous-owned public company in Canada focused on mining royalty agreements. With backing from well-known mining entrepreneur Frank Justra, the company is a big step forward in economically empowering Indigenous communities. Nations Royalty, 77% Indigenous-owned, including the Nisga'a Nation, has royalty deals with major mines like Newmont's Bruce Jack mine. Their unique approach allows Indigenous groups to keep ownership of royalty assets while getting early financial benefits from mining projects on their land. Derek Pattenden is the Chief Investment Officer of Nations Royalty. He joins me now. Derek, thanks very much indeed for talking to us.
Happy to be here.
All right, for some background, let's start with that, Derek. How does Nations Royalty make sure Indigenous communities keep ownership of their royalty assets while still benefiting financially from mining?
Sure. I mean, so the partnership, in a nutshell, is exchanging all or a portion of royalty payments that they're receiving from mining companies in exchange for shares in our company. And so when a nation does that, they'll actually continue to own an interest in their royalty, but also gain an interest in many new royalties. So it's really a sharing of royalties between Indigenous groups, which has numerous benefits beyond increased diversification or bringing value forward. And then the major benefit, the one that has me the most excited, is being able to participate in the upside and the additional value that's created when you pool royalties together, which is really the traditional mining royalty model, which is not new.
Yeah, I'd like to get into that. But Indigenous communities like the Nisga'a Nation, for example, have faced challenges in working with mining companies. How has Nations Royalty helped change the way deals are made?
Well, I mean, in some sense, we're not changing that, right? Like the Indigenous groups we'll be partnering with will have to have an existing impact and benefit agreement with a mining company. So they'll have to have already been thoroughly consulted and had lots of discussions. And a lot of the groups we're really talking with right now, their relationship with the mining company is already quite long. It could, be on an asset that's already been operating for perhaps a decade plus. So right now we're probably focused more on those situations where there's been a long history and a longer relationship between the mining company and the Indigenous group. And that's just because initially here we'll be focused on more advanced stage mining assets, as opposed to, say, an earlier stage exploration play, which maybe that relationship is still new and isn't quite as strong.
That's one arm of the relationship, but I want to talk about another social aspect, the economic gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities in Canada. What's the business model like to help close that economic gap?
Well, I mean, a major part and something we're excited about, as you mentioned, is by being the first majority Indigenous-controlled public company in Canada. I mean, Indigenous groups have started getting more and more access to debt, and debt can be, a very valuable tool to increase wealth if it's used wisely. But the public equity markets is something that really hasn't been tapped into. I mean, again, we just were created in June of 2024, so this is new, and we might be the first in this space, but I'm positive we won't be the last. There'll be, I think, many more exciting things coming in the Indigenous space with Indigenous groups using the tool of the public equity markets, because it's a fantastic way to leverage other money from outside your community in order to build things bigger than you perhaps otherwise would have thought possible beforehand. And then other benefits like getting, best pricing by having access to investors all over the world. And the people that buy the shares are ultimately those that are willing to pay the highest dollar. So it's a very helpful force to help increase wealth that way.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how that pans out. Now, some names here. Frank Justra, a well-known figure in the mining world. How does his involvement help Nations Royalty grow and succeed? I mean, that name is something everyone knows in the fraternity.
Absolutely. I mean, he's a super well-known mining entrepreneur. Myself, my background was 15 years mining investment banking, and you definitely can't go at least even 1 year into that sort of career without his name coming across your desk. So a very well-known financier in the mining space. Perhaps most applicable to our company is he was also the founder of Wheaton Precious Metals, at the time Silver Wheaton, but it's the largest mining royalty company in the world. Market cap's probably around $35 billion. So he knows a lot about how to build a quality, strong mining royalty company. And so he's got a lot of valuable insights he can add to Nations Royalty to help us execute on our strategy and grow a much bigger, stronger, powerful company.
So What's the agenda looking like? I mean, this is brand new. Generally, lifting off in June this year. I mean, there's a vision now in terms of where you put your hands in, what type of intervention you have, and so forth. What's the rest of the year and the months ahead looking like in terms of priority, Derek?
The top priority is forming new partnerships with new Indigenous groups. And what's unusual about this mining royalty company is typically if you're a small mining royalty company, you're going to have a hard time getting access to high quality assets and safe jurisdictions that are at the advanced economic stage. But that's really one of the benefits and advantages we see the Indigenous peoples of Canada having, is that there are Indigenous groups that own some pretty phenomenal royalties all across this country already. So we're actually, pretty swamped with all the different Indigenous groups and assets that we can start discussions on. And that's where we're spending most of our time right now. So we're talking with over 50 different Indigenous groups right now, advancing forward partnerships and, introducing them to the nation's royalty model as well as the Nisga'a Nation, because we are looking for long-term partners here and other people that want to join us on the vision of creating a mining royalty company, but one that is owned and controlled by the Indigenous peoples of Canada.
Something that can become murky, that continues to develop as we talk, is policy around Indigenous issues, policy around Indigenous ownership on a government federal level. Is that difficult to navigate as you map out what your priority is?
In some sense, we don't have to navigate through that quite as much because, again, we're typically getting involved in existing royalty agreements between Indigenous groups and mining companies. So there's not necessarily so much new policy that's happening there. That said, the way that policy is changing and in general, the evolution of payments to Indigenous groups over time have been getting better and better. Like at a super high level, I mean, if you go back far enough, Indigenous groups were getting nothing from the wealth extracted from their lands. And then they started moving into fixed dollar payments, which have some issues with, they don't age very well with inflation and metal price increases. Then they started getting into bottom line payments, maybe percentages of free cash flow, which at least started giving them some participation in metal price increases. And now finally, and what has me really excited, is Indigenous groups are starting to get NSRs or net smelter return royalties. And those are the sort of assets that are arguably the most valuable asset in mining when they're pulled together. And it's the sort of asset that the large mining royalty companies are really attracted to. So that's, to us, a very exciting reason as to why the Indigenous peoples of Canada could create their own very strong mining royalty company.
How do you assess how this has been received by the bottom end of the communities? I mean, do you get a sense as people responding to this positively?
Yeah, I mean, so far the feedback we've been has been quite positive. We're in talks with lots of different Indigenous groups, speaking with lots of different chief and councils, but also have been able to get involved in different AGMs and community meetings, and that's a big part of our model too. Is simply just getting the word out there about our company and what we're up to. And I think a lot of people are just excited for not necessarily has to be nation's royalty, but just a lot more involvement of Indigenous groups and peoples in the business and all the wealth that's being created in their lands, particularly in the natural resource sector.
Let's talk about the role in environmental issues. I mean, disasters often happen and they impact Indigenous communities. We've seen a few news stories this year in tragic ways, mind you, in certain areas. What's the role of nation's royalty in terms of this?
So in many instances, we will essentially have no role in that. I mean, the financial payments are not related to the environmental issues. If an Indigenous group, like in a current IBA structure, a group may be receiving a payment, but that doesn't stop them from raising issues with the mining company that they have over environmental approaches. And as you do point out, yes, I mean, no one hopes things go poorly at a mine, but they can, and it can be quite disastrous for a local community, Indigenous or not. And that's one of the benefits to our model is we can help offer diversification. So at least on top of perhaps having a mess on your hands if things don't go well, you're not also going to have your paycheck go to zero because you're actually able to diversify into different royalty assets that aren't even necessarily all in your own territory, but you can essentially be sharing those assets and sharing that risk with other Indigenous groups.
Well, Derek, as I let you go, looking ahead, does Nation's Royalty plan to expand into other areas like renewable energy, for example, to benefit Indigenous communities beyond mining? What's the thinking there?
In the longer run, we'd be willing to expand. Initially here, we are focused on the mining sector, perhaps some energy as well. But if you look at the 5 largest mining royalty companies in Canada, they're all gold focused. So we have a pretty strong focus there as well. But we're agnostic, and if we can, find a partnership that works between the Nisga'a Nation, Nations Royalty, and other Indigenous groups, we'd be happy to explore that. There's definitely a lot of assets out there outside of mining, but mining is our main focus at the moment.
Derek Pattenden, thanks very much indeed. He's the Nations Royalty Chief Investment Officer. Thanks very much indeed for talking to me.
Thanks for having me.